Climate change, the defining issue of our time, and Southeast Asia is one of the most vulnerable to its impacts. Indeed, there is an urgent need to help people navigate the complexity of climate change. And what better way to do that than storytelling? Join us as we break down how to tell stories that don't only inform, but also move people to action. This is Through the Climate Lens, a conference on climate storytelling in Southeast Asia.
Today, we will be learning a lot as well from our speakers, and I'm excited to hear from them today. So let me just go and present our speakers for today. So for today's session, joining us are journalists and advocates, and we'll be discussing ways to bring fresh perspectives to the climate change discourse and amplify underrepresented voices. So our first speaker is Jennifer Jing Corpus from the Kankanaey Igorot people of Mountain Province in the Philippines. I hope I pronounced that correctly. A lawyer by profession, she is the global policy and advocacy lead for Niatero, a global collaborative designed to directly advance Indigenous peoples and local community stewardship of vital ecosystems around the world. So welcome, Jing. Next, we have Gila Garcia, a freelance multimedia journalist, a climate tracker fellow, and peasant advocate based in Manila. Her photographic work, which documents stories of women, food sovereignty, and the environment, aims to write history from the experience of its makers. So welcome as well, Gila. Gila is someone I've worked with, and I've read a lot of her women-centered stories. Next is my colleague, April Bulanadi. So April is the Policy Advocacy and Communications Manager of Oxfam Pilipinas. So she has over 14 years of experience developing and leading impactful advocacy campaigns and media strategies in the humanitarian and development sector. So definitely, April will be sharing some of the insights of Oxfam as well. Last but not the least is Nanticha Ocharowenchay, or Lynn. So Lynn, I hope I pronounce your name correctly. She is an environmental storyteller and youth climate activist from Thailand. She writes and produces videos on wildlife conservation and sustainable solutions to Indigenous rights and youth movements. Welcome to our all-women panel today. And I hope you guys will be able to have enough time to share your work as well throughout this session. So I'll go on to our first question. I want to ask, how do you describe the state of diversity and climate change reporting? What are the gains and what are we still lacking? So perhaps we can start with our journalists in the panel. Gila, would you want to start off with that?
Hello, good morning, everyone, and thanks for the question, Kristine. Nice to meet you, everybody. So regarding the first question, I could say I'm very optimistic about the state of diversity and climate change reporting, especially now that I'm seeing more climate stories here in the Philippines and even outside, and even across Southeast Asia. So actually, I was talking to a friend the other day, and she described it as a growing seed. And I think that's where we are right now. Like, we're there and ready to grow, and I'm so excited to see more of that. And in terms of gains, I see a lot of women reporting on climate. I mean, right now, our panel is all women. And even the networks that I have, like, I work a lot with women in terms of like climate reporting. So that's very nice because I could already see that we could already offer layered perspectives because there are a lot of women journalists working on climate stories. In terms of what we're lacking, I think perhaps more depth and coverage in mainstream TV and radio, but they also understand like the limitations that we have, for example, in terms of airtime on radio and TV. So because I see a lot of climate reporting now, especially in long forms and like networks or like websites that allow for these stories to be published, but I don't see as much, like, for example, in mainstream TV and radio, and that's where I guess a lot of marginalized communities get their news. So I think that's something that we could work on. But at the same time, it's also another discussion because the different systems in mainstream TV and radios are different in as compared to like online reporting. So yeah, I think it's best if we could tap onto that, talk about climate issues on the radio because it is more accessible to more people here in the Philippines. And I guess if we want to discuss the more theoretical side of it, maybe we could start talking about climate change in the radio, and just sort of like sense how people listening to radio stations are reacting on that. And then, of course, there are resources for journalists working for these stories. Like, I'm very thankful for Climate Tracker and similar networks, because it really helps like publish stories, and at the same time support us in terms of like looking for networks, and of course the finances to do it, because reporting, especially with fieldwork, is already very expensive. So having resources like this is very helpful. But at the same time, I still feel like we could strengthen our communities and newsrooms better to make climate reporting feel more urgent and supported. But I guess that's another discussion beyond climate change reporting, but maybe another discussion in newsrooms. And at the same time, if we talk about the safety of journalists working in field, that's another issue that's that goes beyond newsrooms, but also goes towards how we view media in our society, and at the same time how our systems look at climate and the environment. So there.
Thank you, Gila, for those points. I think you were able to, raise a couple of very valid and, points that I totally agree with. I like that you mentioned the fact that the need for resources, and that there is not much climate reporting in mainstream media. I've worked mostly in mainstream media, and, most of the reporting I've done on climate was through my own, sometimes it's on my own time. And it's really challenging and troublesome if you think about it, that the mainstream newsrooms are not devoting enough resources on a topic that will be, or is already is, the main, existential crisis of the world. So that definitely is something to think about. I want to ask Lynn, is this something that you also experience? Are those some of the factors that you also encounter in your work, and perhaps you have your own insights as well?
Yeah, I feel like with the way it's going in Thailand, it's slightly different. I think we were definitely getting more representation, but again, I still feel like it's quite clear that those who are impacted by climate change itself are not aware of it, and so you wouldn't see those who are actually coming from those communities telling their own stories when it comes to climate stories, because a lot of them don't even realize that it's happening to them, or maybe they do and they don't think it's they think it's just the way it is, and you have to cope with it. And so initially when I started doing climate reporting, and other with other groups of people that I would do reporting on as well, for example, Indigenous communities, I'm kind of midway between journalism and writing, as short films and other kinds of media. So there's a mix between that of having my own perception of it on a story, and I feel like initially I'd have all of these ideas. I'd be like, oh my god, I know what kind of film I want to make, I know what story I want to tell. And it took me a while, to finally to actually go in the field, talk to these people, and bring out their story. Like it's so easy for a writer or an artist or a storyteller to come in and think that have some preconceptions in mind of what climate injustice looks like, or what it means means to be affected by a natural disaster, and you build your own narrative of it, and you portray it that way, and you think you're doing people some justice. But then oftentimes I feel like, at least speaking for myself, I wasn't talking to the people, and it took me a while to realize that. So I feel like that's really important, given the fact that a lot of the people reporting on climate might not be from those affected areas. And we have to talk about privilege in terms of education, or in terms of even me speaking English. That's not a common thing across Thailand. And to be able to come on Climate Tracker and and share these stories. It has, to speak English, that is a small population of us, and most of which are probably not on the front lines of climate impacts. Yeah.
Thanks, Lynn. You raised a very good point about that. Who are the ones doing the climate reporting? They're actually not the ones in this, especially the most climate vulnerable areas in our countries. I wanted to touch on what you mentioned about, sometimes the people in the grassroots, maybe in rural areas, they're not familiar about climate change and we're not able to reach them. I would say in my experience, sometimes when I go to the farmers, for example, and talk to them and ask them about if they notice anything that's changing. They notice something's changing, but it's just that they haven't connected it to climate change yet. But I feel like they definitely understand that something different is happening, with a change in their harvest. And it's good that there are people like you who want to, draw that out, to share those stories with the broader public. So definitely we'll talk about that more. And yeah, we're all speaking in English right now. So definitely we're one of the few who have access to this kind of knowledge and audience as well. And as Gila mentioned a while ago, radio, for example, is climate reporting being done in radio, which is the most accessible to the broader public. So definitely some points. Go ahead, Lynn.
Yeah, if I can add there, when it comes to traditional media as well, whether it's TV or radio, in Thailand, I do see mixes of journalism again, where it's like journalism, you're supposed to be kind of like, somewhere in the neutral, or you're not supposed to be sponsored, basically. And you're starting to see more and more of these greenwashing come in, and because there's such a small representation of climate stories, or from the communities who are affected, and also that gap between the science understanding of, say, what it means to actually do a reforestation project, and then you have the bigger companies who are able to fund so much money into doing promotional materials everywhere with really nice branding, saying, we're doing this wonderful carbon capture reforestation project, but actually it's pushing away a community from their lands. So that kind of pie chart of like who gets a say in things and who actually gets to clarify things is really important.
Thanks for that, Lynn. And that's definitely something that we should be reporting on, right? Companies who are trying to greenwash and make it appear that they're being sustainable and conscientious about their work. So we move on now, I guess, to the members of our panel from the civil society organizations. For Jing, who was not able to be here at the start, I'm currently asking how you would describe the state of diversity in climate change reporting, and what are the gains that we are still lacking. What do you think about this? You come from the indigenous peoples groups, and so I'm curious about what they think about climate reporting as well.
Thanks for the question. My point of view is kind of colored by having just come from Egypt at COP27 and just having experienced the reporting there. I can tell you that there was a significant number of indigenous peoples there, 250 to 300. Not all of us had badges, but all of us tried our best to make our voices heard. Now the problem is that we had a lot of indigenous delegates, but not all were connected. They all had really interesting stories to tell because they were in front lines, and I thought it was a good venue, to get them connected to some of those doing the reporting on climate change, but we're able to completely maximize that space. But having said that, one of the concerns is that it's because a lot of the climate reporting happens around the COPs, right? And the more controversial, the better. So there was some pressure for some of the indigenous interviewees to be as controversial as possible. Talk about extreme weather events, but one of the main discussions there was actually loss and damage that happened very gradually over the long term. So it was hard to get those kinds of stories noticed, just those kinds of effects that creep up on the communities. And then in terms of the solutions side, it's even more difficult because many want to hear about what disasters are happening in the communities. What have you observed? What are the changes? But when we start talking about solutions and about changes in values, it's less sexy. So that's something that we're, as a civil society organization, as a foundation, something that we're trying to support. So we brought our own team, but obviously this is non-traditional media, but we brought our own team to sort of conduct interviews among the indigenous leaders who were there so that we could talk about, deeper things, not just the controversial, the headline grabbing things. And then we tried our best to connect with the mainstream media. So BBC, we got some of the indigenous representatives to be interviewed by BBC. They had good output, I think. So that's one. There was a lot of attention because it was the COP, but we wanted more attention on the non-controversial or the headline grabbing issues, but also the solutions that indigenous peoples could present. And then beyond the COP, I think it's important to make these sort of long stories, these deep stories, getting people to go to the front lines and talk to the people who are there, exactly like some of the earlier speakers were saying. And as a foundation, we invest heavily in teams that can go to these front lines and that can speak the language. Because we talk about our national languages, but for indigenous peoples, we have 6,000 different languages all over the world, right? So we have some we've developed with the Cherokee language, the Blackfeet language, et cetera, and takes resources to be able to make those kinds of documentaries understood. And then one thing we're trying to do also as an organization is to push it through the film festivals. So we have these short form documentaries that we present at film festivals. And, we try to popularize them so that there's more diversity. So obviously the answer to your question is that there isn't much diversity, but there are organizations that are trying their best. We've been working with an organization called If Not Us, Then Who? And we've been cooperating on training young indigenous reporters, storytellers, so that they can tell their own stories from their communities. And then we provide support for some of the subtitles and post-production and so forth. But yeah, we wish there could be more diversity, and we wish there could be a multiplication of these kinds of efforts to get the voices of the communities, the front lines, to the mainstream spaces.
Thank you, Jing, for sharing your experience at the COP as well. I feel like it's been repeatedly mentioned. I think climate reporting is such a labor-intensive effort. On the side of the journalist, people like Gila and Lean really go down to the grassroots. They try to bridge the gap between what the mainstream media does and what our audience is really experiencing. And groups like Niatera and Oxfam are the ones helping bridge that gap as well. Hopefully we'll see, it'll be more fruitful in the future, and we have more groups working and, more efforts, I guess, from the journalists themselves to really seek out such stories. Thank you for that, Jing. I move on to April. April is actually my co-host in a radio show for Radio Veritas, where we actually discuss climate change as well. So April, what do you think about climate reporting, not just in the work that we do, but with journalists that we work with as well?
Yeah, thank you, Kristine. First, I want to thank Climate Tracker for inviting Oxfam to this wonderful event. For me, in terms of gains, I think there are already some huge strides in the practice of diversity in climate change reporting in the Philippines. The fact that we are having this conversation right now, which I can't remember when I was a journalist like 12 years ago, that is already a welcome development. In recent years, we have also seen a lot of organizations working more with media organizations on how to strengthen climate change reporting in the Philippines. In fact, we have recently had a journalism fellowship programs for journalists and youth advocates with Climate Tracker as well. In terms of lacking, as we all know, a lot of things have yet to be improved, no? In Oxfam, we have reported many times how climate-induced disasters have widened further the economic, gender, and racial inequalities between the rich and the poor. Every year at the World Economic Forum, we always say how the gap between the rich and the poor widens further. And when we talk about the poor, we can't help but notice that 70% of these poor are actually women who are pushed further into poverty, and inequalities because of the climate crisis. So there's more than what meets the eye, actually. Sometimes when we do our reporting, we tend to focus sometimes on the numbers, in the aftermath of disasters, the number of deaths, the cost of damages, the extent of damage. But we sometimes forget that behind these numbers, there are actual real people, someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone's sister who are affected by this climate crisis. When livelihoods are damaged and breadwinners of the family are forced to migrate in another place to support the needs of the family, have we ever asked who does most of the unpaid care work at home? Who does the household work? Who takes care of the children and the elderly? Mostly, these are the women. I remember, Kristine, we have visited several areas in Eastern Samar in the Philippines affected by disasters, by typhoons in the past. And they would always tell us they would sometimes travel 4 to 6 hours just to fetch water for the family. No, we have also released a survey in the past saying that the amount of care work duties performed by women and girls, especially in rural communities, are like 10 to 11 hours, which is 3 to 4 times more than what usually men do. So there's really a lot of things that we need to do. And we have not yet talked about the issue of protection in the evacuation centers. No, in the aftermath of disasters, when people are forced to stay in evacuation centers without proper sanitation facilities and electrification, we have also noticed the higher incidence of gender-based violence in those evacuation centers. And we have also not yet talked about how members of the LGBTQIA+, persons with disabilities, members of the ethnic minorities, are accessing aid without when they don't have the proper legal identification. So how were they able to access this government aid in times of disasters? So there's a lot of issues actually that we need to surface, which I hope we can report more when we do our climate change reporting, not just here in the Philippines, but also across the world.
Thank you, April, for raising those issues. I think it's very important because as Jing said, it's not just, I think we've gone past disaster reporting already at this point. And it's good. There's actually a growing group of solutions journalism writers and producers. I love coming from Oxfam, of course, I'm biased, but I love the work of Oxfam because it's able to touch on the far-reaching effects of climate change, on unpaid care work and gender justice as well. It's all connected. And it really goes to show that, whatever story you do, in fact, even if you're covering business or even crime maybe, or disaster reporting, you really can link it to climate change and raise that discussion as well. So thanks for that, April. Definitely something to think about. I hope the journalists who are listening to us today will also have story ideas from what Jing and April are sharing as well. Okay, so let us move on to the next question. I also invite our audience. There's a Q&A option in this Zoom call. Please send your questions there so we can ask them at the end of our Q&A, our formal Q&A. So my question is, how should journalists elevate the voice of the marginalized communities? So perhaps we can start with Lynn. Besides what you do already, perhaps you have some advice to those starting out in climate reporting as well.
Yeah, again, I it comes back to that part about, where I was talking about how I came in all with my own stories, and I thought that was I was portraying their livelihood, right? And it's not true. So I think the best way to really elevate their voices is to first just speak to them. Like sometimes we cover stories and we go with these assumptions, and then we paint a scene of the hardships or all this stuff, but sometimes maybe they're not actually feeling that way. Maybe it's to them. I interviewed this community actually in Thailand, where they had rising sea levels, and it's like the coastline was disappearing. So I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was kilometers of the coastline has disappeared. Like they've had to move their homes 3 times in one person's lifetime. Actually 7. Like one of the families had to move their home 7 times because the coastline just kept receding. But I asked some of the people, about how they felt and what their challenges are, like their visions for the future. And what they told me was just some, I was like, are you scared or are you this? And they were just like, well, it just happens, it's not like we're not constantly running away from something. It happens and we adapt to it and then we move on. It's not like they're freaking out about it. Whereas coming in as an outsider, you might think like, wow, this is a story of tremendous anxiety. And yeah, so it's always good to talk to the people that you're writing a story about. I think that's the number one rule. And talk to them and really talk to them with an open mind. Like don't come with a built-in narrative in mind. And second, what I've been trying off more, I know is like our job as reporters is to report and write these stories, but another way we can really empower these communities is for them to tell their own stories, and equipping them with the means to do so. Because it's something I learned as well in the past 2 years of, going into Indigenous communities, and a lot of them, they have amazing stories to tell. I bet, their lives are crazy. Like I'm sure there's so many interesting things, but these skills in telling a story, they're as much as it may seem like common sense to us sometimes, not just to like, it's not for most people, like not just for Indigenous communities, but as in if you speak to an engineer, maybe they're not able to tell a story as well. So the skill of using language and the skill of expressing oneself and sharing something which to that person might feel very familiar and like why do you even care about this? That skill is going to be really useful to equip them in talking to media. So what I know is a lot of NGOs, not a lot, but a few NGOs have visited those communities. I've gone to, the ones impacted by like mines who want to build over their communities, or like the government wants to build a dam across their homes. And these NGOs have come in with journalists and provided them with media training. Like, okay, we're going to have journalists come here and you have to know how to speak to them, how to share your story. Because as journalists, what we can do is we can document and we can capture their stories, but we're not able to produce it. The stories must already be there, and we can only cover it if they give it to us. So yeah, helping them share their stories, I think is very crucial, and not just in terms of media training and getting them to be more charismatic or being able to vividly share details of their stories. But also I recently went to this film festival called Jackson Wild, and there was this movie that screened. It was fantastic. It's called The Territory. You should go look it up if you get a chance. I don't know where it's screening, but it's there is one part, and I don't want to spoil it, but there is one part where the filmmaker actually provides a tribe in the Amazon with proper camera gear, and teaches them how to use it. And so the filmmaker doesn't even have to be there. First of all, like field work, reporting in the field, especially for Indigenous communities where it's really remote, it's very expensive. And a lot of journalists want to cover those stories, but they're unable to because they don't have the budget. But why not? Like super easy. There, take a camera, you document all of your living. You're there all the time anyway. You know exactly who's the characters. You know exactly what you're going through. And as simple as pressing the red button, like record button, and there you have it, a bunch of valuable footage that you cannot get anywhere else, captured by the person who owns the story, and allowing them to tell the stories themselves with a little support from these filmmakers to edit, put it together and distribute these stories. So it's like working together. It's like sometimes I feel like reporters, we come in and we parachute in, and it's almost like exploitative, going in, okay, give me your story. Oh, you're so pitiful, and take your story, go out, sell the story. Okay, great. Like I've written the story, and then you go off and go elsewhere, and the community doesn't actually get anything. So it's really, really nice when you're able to make it more of a collaborative effort, than it being a one-sided thing.
Thanks for that, Lynn. Really good insights. I like that you pointed out you should go into these communities and have no built-in narrative, because definitely, people can surprise you, and that doesn't make your story less compelling, right? If it's not like this disaster about their anxiety about climate change, it just means you end up with another unique story. I think us who do climate reporting, we get tired of the formulas already that we're seeing, and it's really about time to have more diverse storylines as well, especially coming from the grassroots. And you mentioned parachute journalists. I think a lot of people are guilty about that. Even some of us, perhaps, when we go into these fellowships and go to these remote areas and have our own assumptions. But you are correct. I always look at reporting as not talking down to your interview subject. They are more knowledgeable about what they are experiencing more than you. And so everybody will benefit if that language gap is just bridged and they're able to share their story with the rest of the world. So thank you for that, Lynn. Gila, how about you? How do you think journalists should elevate the voice of the marginalized communities?
I guess for me, it's always by always putting their interests in front when we frame our stories, just like how Lynn described, like ask how they're feeling. And I guess for me, it's that means listening to how they define climate, resilience, disaster, and coping in their own terms. And because for me, I already come from a privileged background. Like I was able to finish formal education, but I get that sense that sometimes the stories that we read, the climate stories that we read, are still hard to digest by, let's say, a broader sector of audience, because maybe they're explained in very academic or in very loaded jargons. And I'm not saying that these are words, these are hard to understand, but maybe it can also just create more gaps in terms of like communicating climate stories. So I guess it's best to discuss it with how people are experiencing it and their simple anecdotes and the stories that people can relate to, because I've also observed that most people mostly lean on stuff that are relatable. So I guess to elevate the voices, we should make their stories relatable to I guess how we live our daily lives, because climate is so intertwined with how we live our lives every day. So it's not just so I guess sometimes I think it's not just a beat, because it's so embedded in our lives. So how do we make the climate angle shine in that story? So And I also agree with Lean on like talking about and making it more collaborative. I think it's very nice to work with grassroots organizations and communities because they have a certain way of understanding their landscape and their communities. And if we could just really listen to them and how they want to be represented, that's a really good way to elevate their voices. Because I agree, and that we shouldn't come with like a built-in narrative, because like for example, I also work with this particular community, and of course there would be people who would immediately have this what Lynn said about tremendous anxiety. But this community also knows how to like work around what they're experiencing, and they have their own words on explaining or processing their emotions or what they're going through. So always just come in with an open mind and frame the stories in such a way that you would know it's very truthful for how these people are experiencing their climate issues.
Thank you, Gila. You mentioned academic words. I think there's no other way to say it, but it is hard to understand. I mean, I cover science. I do science reporting as well. And I always tell scientists, there's a better way of communicating what you know, so that it would really benefit a lot of people. And I think that's the challenge. And our role as journalists as well, to educate the people in the academe or in science to bridge that gap. I like what you said, that highlighting the solutions as well. Lynn also mentioned this, because I think there's a lot of benefit from that, because we learn there are a lot of indigenous practices that help in climate mitigation and adaptation, and there's it's treasure trove of insights that the rest of the world is probably not hearing about. Perhaps Jing could share something about that. What are the stories that you feel are like such great stories among indigenous peoples and it's not being covered? And if you have some tips for journalists as well.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more with what the first two, with what Lynn and Gila have said. And I wanted to focus on agency of indigenous peoples. About, we were part of developing the idea of the territory as well. And we're, as Niatero, supporting the nomination of the territory as one of the, nominees for the Oscars. So I think that approach is really good. And, just proceeding from some of the findings by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the global society of, group of scientists working on climate change. They keep on saying that traditional knowledge is an important part of the solution to climate change. However, they don't have any idea about how to work with it. And then you come to COP27, where the week before, there were meetings of the indigenous knowledge holders, and hardly any coverage. Those events which happened, I think, a couple of days before COP27 started, they were called contributors events, and they were basically traditional knowledge holders who were talking about their experiences from the ground. It was so difficult to bring these people here because of the visas. They didn't even have passports because they were really from indigenous communities. And then, I felt like it was just such a missed opportunity that these events weren't covered, because I think we really need to highlight, for the scientists, but also for the policymakers, exactly what traditional knowledge being part of the solution means. We have to unpack it because it's also technical, no? And then one of the things that we're trying to do, because there's another COP this coming December. It's a biodiversity COP this time, but I think climate's going to be an important element because we're going to be hosted by the Canadian government. And there's going to be an indigenous village put up. And we're trying there to get the people who are trying to recover the caribou herd from the northern parts of Canada. We're trying to get them there. And we're trying to get those indigenous guardians who are there to talk about their stories, because it's just as simple as them being on the land and their observations about the changes in the number of species, the changes in the different parts of the territories, their territories. So those are the kinds of things. How do we make it more sexy so that there's more uptake? We also have stories from communities around disaster risk reduction and about how recovering ancient place names would provide important clues about where not to build, where not to establish cities. Because, you know, when we ask some indigenous communities about what was the traditional place name of this particular area that was hit by a disaster, and they say it means catch basin. And, you know, no wonder they were flooded. No wonder there were landslides in those places. So those are the things that I'm really hoping could be highlighted moving forward, because they're just these simple stories from the community, but they actually can save lives. And, you know, they can give guidance to scientists about exactly what traditional knowledge being part of the solution means.
Thank you, Jing. That's what I love about journalism, because journalists are able to reach out to the grassroots, but also to scientists and, you know, people in government, just by asking questions, even if we don't have the answers, right? Just by asking questions and raising these issues. We are part of the solution to that as well. April, how about you? What are your tips as a former journalist as well? What can you say to our journalists?
Okay. To elevate the voice of the marginalized communities, as I've mentioned also earlier, it's very important that we look deeper into the systemic inequalities and the differentiated impacts of the climate crisis, because it's never always the same for everyone. So we have to always put that in our minds. And then I also mentioned earlier the importance of putting the issues of women, girls, LGBTQIA+, and other members of the marginalized sectors on the table. We have to put that at the front and center of our climate change reporting. And when we report about them, we have always to remember to present these people as survivors and not as hopeless victims, because I always notice that in the way we report typhoon victims. That's always how we use to do our reporting. But maybe this is also an opportunity for us to empower them by calling them as survivors. Because if we want to empower them, if we want to raise their voice, we also need to empower them when we do our reporting. We also need to value their right to participate and to be heard. Ask consent when we do our reporting, when we take our photos. Never always forget that. They also have that right, the same right that we also have. We don't want our photos to be taken by anyone, right? So we have to always remember that. And then we also need to remember the do no harm principle when we do our reporting. There are certain groups who are at higher risk to harm. There are the children, people affected by disasters and the armed conflict. Recently, we had the Typhoon Paeng, in Mindanao. As we all know, they're not just affected by the armed conflict, but as well by the tropical storm. So there's a greater responsibility for us to be careful in our reporting about them. People living with HIV, survivors of gender-based violence, LGBTQIA+, people in religious and ethnic minorities, as also mentioned by Jing, and then people who speak out against the government and large corporations. So we have to be very careful when we do our reporting as well. We make sure that when we do our report, it won't put harm to them in the end. Our goal should be to uplift their lives and to help them in the long run.
Thank you so much, April. Very, very good points. Before I joined the development sector, I didn't really have, to be honest, that idea of, you need to get consent, because if you work in mainstream media, you just go out there with a big camera and then shoot. Sometimes you just stick a microphone and just ask someone without them even agreeing to the interview beforehand. So that definitely is a good reminder. It's not just about getting the story, but also making sure that your interviewees are comfortable, you respect their human rights, definitely. So those are very good examples. We have a bit more time. I wanted to ask the panel as well. Jing was talking about the COP. For me, when I was starting out in climate reporting, it felt like a very steep learning curve, you know. I'm very thankful that like groups like Climate Tracker was there to guide us how to navigate the COP, you know, the politics of it all, how to not be distracted by the headline stories, you know, and really work on stories that really matter, that should be highlighted. Who wants to, perhaps, is there anyone here who want to volunteer and talk about that kind of climate reporting as well, besides, you know, the features and the long form type of climate reporting? Are there any tips from you guys? I'm going to Jake, because she's the one who just came from the top. Do you have any tips? Like I don't know how long you've been participating in the COP, but for like a lot of the climate reporters are young journalists. So for those who perhaps have just been to one or have not even been to one.
Yes, it's a very difficult place to navigate, and it's become a monster in recent years. So yeah, you have the main negotiations, right? Unfortunately, a lot of the main negotiation spaces are, and that's where the agreements are hammered out. And a lot of them are close to civil society and close to indigenous representatives. And then you have the pavilions, which are you have pavilions within the blue zone, which is negotiators only, pavilions outside of the blue zone, which it's called the green zone, which is open to others who don't have official badges to enter the negotiation areas. And then it's crazy how the pavilions have exploded. You know, we have members of the Indigenous Caucus complaining sort of that now their lives have been taken over by all of these side events, because it's gotten to be like a trade fair, you know. I think what's important to do when attending the COP is to make connections earlier. If you're interested in reporting on Indigenous peoples, there is an Indigenous Caucus. There are focal points. And there's a group managing the participation of the Indigenous representatives there. It's the same for the other major groups, for I think civil society, for the youth, etc. One interesting thing about the two recent COPs in Glasgow and in Sharm el Sheikh is that there was a significant number of oil and fossil fuel lobbyists, no? So we tried hard to call that out. So apart from the green zone, the blue zone, the official negotiation areas, there were attempts to protest as well. However, you know, it was very difficult for journalists and activists in Sharm, because there were very, very small, well-defined spaces outside of the places where people can hear you that were designated as protest areas. But I think it's also important to reach out to these campaigners and these protesters, no, because a lot of them are quite well informed. They're quite well informed. They know the science, and they have good, strong advocacy messages. There were a couple from our Indigenous Caucus who very creatively managed to get tickets, highly coveted tickets to the Biden event. And, you know, because the US was, you know, one of the countries who didn't want very strong language on phasing out of fossil fuels and coal, they called the government out and their badges were pulled. And they are essentially banned for life from all of the future COPs. So yeah, it's also important to reach out to these activists and try to see what their point of view is, and then make connections to the focal points. Take some time to do some prep work to learn who the focal points are, who are going to be there, because they really have interesting stories to tell. Yeah. Language is always a problem because there are some who speak Spanish only. The Brazilians speak Portuguese only. So we also have to be prepared to be able to reach out to them. There are some who only speak their indigenous languages. So I think preparation is key. Know where to look for your sources when you're in the COP, and you know, just ask some of the veterans to be your guides, so that you don't get lost or don't get drowned during that hugely complicated space.
Thank you, Jing. Definitely. I what I love about climate journalism is that there's a lot of solidarity among the journalists as well, because it's such a crazy space that has as you said, the COP is crazy right now, and my experience, I also learned from veteran journalists, so that's very helpful. And you're correct. Sometimes the side stories are more interesting than the negotiations. There's government negotiators who are um trying to basically in charge of our lives almost, because they come up with disagreements, but there are so many more voices outside of the COP that we need to listen to. I'll move on to our last question. Perhaps you can also share your message here before we go with the Q&A with our audience. So how do you show that climate justice goes hand in hand with the struggles of the marginalized communities? I want to go with April first now, just to shift it a bit.
Okay, actually, I have a very short answer to that, Kristine. No, there is no climate justice without gender justice. I'm sure some of our listeners or watchers here have already heard about that. So we always have to put the issues of women, girls, members of the LGBTQIA plus, and other members of the marginalized sectors at the front and center of everything that we report about the climate, about the climate crisis. So that's for me. That's all for me, Kristine.
Thank you, April. Gila, how about you?
I guess for me, the same way with April, there is no climate justice without system change. So I feel like when talking about issues related to climate, especially when you speak to people in the communities, you can feel that it's quite hard for them to articulate it because it's so embedded in their lives, like in every aspect of their lives. So these climate problems are very present, but since they're so intertwined, it's hard to articulate it for them. Like, for example, there's this urban poor worker who experiences hunger or poverty because they're unable to buy food because of their poor wages and with the skyrocketing prices of like commodities. So when you speak to them on climate issues, that's not the first thing that they actually point out, because what they experience first, for example, or what their pressing concern first is hunger. So even if there is a climate issue for them, what's more pressing is food and shelter. But when you listen to their stories, they're very intertwined. Like, for example, their problem for like their lack of access to healthy food makes them very vulnerable to diseases brought by environmental destruction. Their problem or lack of decent shelter makes them very vulnerable to climate disasters. So those are the little things that you could observe in like the daily lives of marginalized communities that are very embedded to climate. So I guess when we speak of climate issues, we must also place these issues in a way that also meets where the marginalized people are. So for example, if we work with farmer communities, what does it mean for them? Like, what does it mean for the land that they till? Like, what do the droughts mean for them? Like, and how do these, for example, affect their crops and their harvest? Like, when we talk to workers, how would a hazard pay mean for them, especially when they have to like go to the factories during very strong typhoons? So how would housing mean for the urban poor? So at the same way, when we frame these issues that are addressing their present economic concern, we also get to strengthen their interest in like participating discussions such as this. So I feel like if we address their present socio-economic concerns and we lessen their climate vulnerability, and when we honor that these people together can make changes, then we can also mobilize these people to be more concerned about these issues. Because yeah, I think we can't really expect like peasants and fisher folk to immediately say end climate crisis when their immediate problem is they are going hungry, when they don't have their own lands to till. So I guess the climate crisis and like talking about it will also require addressing the dominance that bigger countries have on the policies of vulnerable nations like the Philippines. And a lot of that will start with addressing the immediate problems of these vulnerable sectors.
Thank you for that, Gila. How about you, Lynn?
I think back to your initial question, like how do you show that marginalized communities, like their living goes hand in hand with these climate injustices, right? I think that applies with every kind of injustice, really. You know, when we're speaking about systemic issues, like as we had seen during COVID, if you're part of the marginalized community, everything affects you like a handful. And I think what's more important than not more important, but like the root of showing that is to show how this is all a systemic issue that is covering like an umbrella over the topics, and not lose sight of that, because sometimes whether it's with climate change or the pandemics, reporting can be so, what's the word for it, like minuscule, like it can have like a smaller lens, whereas you're not really looking at the big picture, and you might end up reporting on small specific events. But rather, if you can constantly remind the audience and also other media outlets, like, hey, by the way, this is not the issue. We've got a bigger issue at hand. I think that's the key to really addressing it.
Thank you, Lynn. How about you, Jing? How do you show that climate justice goes hand in hand with the struggles of the marginalized communities?
Well, let's go with the slogan. There's no climate justice without full respect for Indigenous people's rights, of course. And but when I've been reflecting while all the others were speaking, whenever we say respect for Indigenous people's rights, it's actually shorthand for systems change, no? Because a huge chunk of the advocacy we have is no to false solutions. So no to solutions that give the appearance of addressing the climate crisis, but actually supports the system that caused the climate crisis in the first place. So, for example, we cannot have, carbon trading and allowing those that emit the most to get away from it just by throwing money at the problem. That doesn't solve it, no? And when we say respect for Indigenous rights, we want respect for their life ways, their visions as Indigenous peoples. And this is a vision where there is no overconsumption. This is a vision where we don't destroy the earth. We have to be mindful of the next generations. So I think there's a lot to go. There's a long way to go in unpacking, what we mean when we say Indigenous peoples hold the solution, because it's also a change in the worldview that we have. We cannot solve things, as I said earlier, by just allowing companies to greenwash. They have to reduce emissions at source. We can't just, allow countries to report that they're meeting their targets by purchasing credits from wherever. They have to reduce emissions at source, and they have to change their systems. There's also there's a market solution, but there's also, more importantly, a policy solution. We have to change our systems. We have to listen to Indigenous peoples more. We have to care about the future generations more. We have to, change this system of unbridled use of our resources, because that's how we got here in the first place.
Thank you so much, Jing. All of you mentioned, the systemic side of it all. It's not just climate justice, but really justice for everyone. And I think the main point here is intersectionality, which is, the climate crisis has affected our whole lives. It has affected people's mental health. Some of the younger generation, they don't want to have kids anymore because of the climate emergency. So it's such a big thing to really think about, the importance of climate justice. And I hope, more people will realize that it goes really so much deeper than, what we just see of extreme weather events and other disasters. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. We have a bit more time for our Q&A. I'll just check if there are some who sent in questions. There's one audience member, Rogelio Medina, saying hi to April as a former student. It's nice to see you as former student. And then we have someone asking, how do you make the stories of the marginalized matter or more interesting amid business and political pressures? I love this question because if you're pitching especially to media, not just the journalists here, but also our friends from the civil society, how do you make it interesting? And how do you make sure that it's actually published despite, the business and political pressures? May I ask who would want to volunteer first? Is anyone here has had experience like that as well, or see it as a challenge in reporting or pitching to media? Did this question just stump us for a moment?
Hello.
Go ahead, Sheila.
There, April also. All right, I'll go. I guess it's really a struggle or a conflict that we journalists or like people in the development sector have to navigate with, because as you know, in some ways, the decisions of our newsrooms, or like the decisions that allow that actually agree to have our stories published are still bounded by like political by business or like political interests, because we are in that system. But at the same time, I guess to make this more interesting, it's really about like what Jing said, changing the worldview. So make sure that when you write your stories, you're able to subtly, influence how your reader looks at like what's important, what's really important. Sometimes it makes me think, why do projects like why do commercial projects receive more funding over like stories that are very important, that are about life and death? So I guess it's not just a problem that you could address within the newsroom, but a problem that we also need to address beyond newsrooms, beyond the business interests. And to make it more interesting, I guess you really have to find editors who are also who also have the same interest of like really putting out real stories from the grassroots. And to do that, it's really networking and finding the circles that support the stories that you want to publish, but also at the same time taking note and like really minding that we really try our best to navigate this very hard industry, but at the same time it really matters to try to just put our stories out there, because in some ways we're still able to influence policy and influence how people look at these certain issues.
Okay, I think April wanted to answer that question as well.
Yeah, actually, Jill has already mentioned a lot of them, but just to add more, I guess this is where the power of influencing comes in. No, if we know very much how these issues are affecting our marginalized communities, I think it is also our objective to be able to advocate, no, for these people whose voices are not always heard in the mainstream media. And then timing is very important. I would always say this as a campaigner as well for Oxfam. We know that there's a lot of campaign spikes going on across the year. Maybe we can find, sweet spots across the year where when to forward these very important issues as well. And then the importance of putting the human face every time we do our reporting. Of course, sometimes there are, limited resources available in the newsroom for us, that we always just look at the, available data online. But as much as possible, if we can, always don't forget, as we have also mentioned in our answers earlier, to always put the issues of these women. And when I say put the issues of these women, we talk to them, we show their faces as much as possible, with their consent, of course. And then there are also several story grant opportunities available from different organizations. Maybe we can take advantage also of that opportunity for us to be able to write these stories that truly matter. And yeah, influencing as well the editors to be able to publish these stories as well.
Thank you, April. Is there anyone else in the panel who would want to answer that question? Okay. I wanted to chime in on that as well, because I've worked with leading newsrooms in the Philippines. And I've definitely had a few stories killed because they were about mining, for example. Sometimes I would cover stories on plastic pollution, and the newsroom managers would not want the businesses to be mentioned because they're advertisers. I'm no longer in the media industry, so I can talk about these things. But within the news circles, we all know that this happens. And I think one thing to go about it is that you just need to present an undeniable fact. This is a challenge as well to the campaigners, because if it's especially a quantitative study that you're presenting, that they really are the carbon majors, for example, right? It's an undeniable fact that they have so much accountability in the climate crisis, and I think it's going to be hard to ignore this kinds of stories. Oxfam does a lot of studies as well. If you check our website, we've had some press releases on climate financing, mentioning how only, I think, 1% is given to communities out of the billions dollars of climate financing that enters Asia. We have another study about how billionaires' global emissions are, I think 100% more, or like multiples, unimaginable amount compared to what an ordinary person would carbon's footprint is. So I think if we come in with the data and we come in with these facts and saying, this is how it is, we should be writing about this, I think that's what will make it interesting. And definitely the gatekeepers, the editors and the newsroom managers, you really need to influence them and work your magic on them. I guess show that you're a journalist with integrity, and it's worth it to take a risk on your story because it's an airtight story, for example. So I think those are important things to note. We have two more questions here. One question, how can we highlight gender issues when talking about the climate crisis? Who would want to take that on?
Maybe
Go ahead, Lynn.
I can go. How to foster more collaboration, maybe money. Like, at the end of the day, like funding is it's crucial, and that really enables a lot of collaboration. Like a lot of people I have gotten to know and work with have come from funding opportunities or fellowship grants or all these sort of things that allow us the time and the platform and the capacity to be able to actually meet online or actually work on certain stories together, and go into the field as well. And yeah, I think that is a big part. But aside from that, just opportunities that maybe story prompts, like I've seen a few cross collaboration journalism platforms where if there are certain themes that are already put out there, I think journalists may find it easier to connect rather than like, here's a big world out there, go find something, go find each other.
Thanks for that, Lynn. I want to ask this question to Gila, since I know that she does a lot of women's issues reporting as well. So the question is, how can we highlight gender issues when talking about climate crisis? I'm curious as well, do you go out and do a story with a climate lens or a gender lens, or it's like merged for you? You always think about those two things?
I guess for me, it's really merged because I don't know, like for me, like what I said earlier, I feel like climate reporting is not just a beat because it's really intertwined. In the same way as gender issues are also so intertwined. So for me, it's not just a beat, like it's really part of a woman's life to like battle with climate, battle with equality. So those are things that we deal with every day. So it's not just like a beat for me. So when in terms of highlighting gender issues, I guess for me, I really make it a point to look for the woman in the community and really talk to them because I feel like uh because I feel like that's something that we don't really I don't know. I'm not sure for other reporters, but I'm not sure if they also consider gender when they look for their sources. Like for me, when I go to farmer communities, I would always ask, is there a woman who could speak? Because their issues are very different. Like you also mentioned, April, about the unpaid care work, and I don't know, like for me those are things that we can't really extract from other genders, but it's very obvious for women. Like for example, when there are disasters, it means more unpaid care work for women. So uh it's in order to highlight it, we need to speak to women to and listen to their experiences, and just discuss how they're navigating towards this towards disasters, and how they're coping and how they are coping. So yeah.
Thanks for that, Gila. I don't want to keep people from their lunch. So I'm going on to the next question. This will be the last question. And it's okay if all of you would want to answer this. So how can we foster more collaboration between journalists and civil society organizations? I want to start with Jing. How do you think journalists could work more with CSOs?
Yeah, well, it's just to reach out more, or I think find venues for the journalists to be linked with the civil society organizations. The approach that we take from our organization is so far it's a storytelling approach, but we're also building it out for our communications work. But we have something called kin theory, and we have indigenous storytellers. It's like a platform where we link indigenous storytellers with those who would like to finance a story, or producers who would like to commission a story. So we have that kind of platform, and we've been promoting it in different venues, including places like Jackson Wild, like the Camden International Film Festival, and so forth. Some of our staff now are in, I think, Panama, somewhere in South America, to also promote that. And then we have, I think it would be great for civil society organizations and foundations to have sort of fellowships. And then the last area, so fellowships, to support journalists to be able to tell stories that matter, stories from the front lines, from the point of view of marginalized people. And then lastly, is, we work, we work mostly on the ground with indigenous partners, and we support them to carry out their life plans, their vision of the world. If that includes land titling, securing tenure over their indigenous territory, then we support that. And then if their vision is to how to bring indigenous youth back to the community, we support that. But one thing we also support is developing communications and storytelling capacity within their communities. And that way we make sure that the stories from the ground actually reach other people, hopefully the mainstream. But I think it's important for civil society to be more consciously, supporting these kinds of efforts and building those links through, it could be monetary support, it could be technical support, building platforms to link people, but those kinds of things.
Thank you, Jing. How about the rest of our panel? Is there anyone else who would want to answer that question?
Okay, I can answer that, Kristine. Okay, as part of the civil society organizations, I think it's really very important, to find ways to network and partner in many creative ways, As for us in Oxfam, we have conducted a lot of activities together with the media So there's the story grant opportunities, which Jing has also mentioned earlier, the journalism fellowship programs. There are also some opportunities to do gender mainstreaming with the media. When we do our fellowships with them, there's also the possibility of partnering with the media to do photo exhibits, film showing or story gathering opportunities, which we have also done in the past. So yeah, I think the key here is really working together. In many ways, we can to push forward our vision for a more sustainable and equal future for everyone amidst the climate crisis.
Thank you, April. I'm actually the media officer of Oxfam Pilipinas. So to our journalists here, if you have stories you want to pursue with us, message me on Twitter or tweet me at Kristine Sabillo. There is someone raising their hand among our attendees. Afifa Nasar Ula, or is this for a question? Is it possible to unmute the mic of attendees? Oh, there. Okay. So you are permitted to share your question.
Can I talk to you?
Yes, go ahead.
Actually, I'm from Pakistan and I have been a climate tracker fellow in the COP27. And I just want to ask about either being in Pakistan and South of Asia, are we like Nia Teru is working on indigenous people. So a journalist who is working like me in Pakistan, we can be collaboration with Nia Teru, or can Nia Teru support us on this regard? Because there are lots of stories in Pakistan related to indigenous people. Some areas are specific for indigenous people. I think every culture and every society is based on indigenous people. So talking about their issues related to climate changing, and because whenever climate changes, lots of difficulties they have to suffer related to their migration, their food, their survival and all that. So I want to ask, if I want to work, or other journalists who are based in Pakistan and they want to work. So is there any institution like Nia Teru that would be supporting us or other journalists to talk about those stories? Because there are lots of problems if we by ourselves go to those spaces on those areas and cover those issues. So I just want to know about this issue. I think I would be able to mention my problem and others' problem too. Yes, thank you.
Well, our operation is quite small. I think there are many other similar efforts in existence, efforts to support journalists. And, here in the Philippines, I've heard about citizen journalism, one of the big media outfits supporting that kind of thing. From the Nia Teru side, I put the website of Kin Theory in the chat, in the question and answer box, I think. And that's one place to make those kinds of connections. Periodically, we have a call for applications. It's a competitive application process for our journalism fellowship, but it's a very small, as I said, it's a small operation. We only fund 10 per year. And, but yeah, I think my suggestion is to seek out some of the other supporters of citizen journalism.
Thank you, Jing. Are there any other questions? We have none anymore in the Q&A form. Okay, wait, someone is, did you raise your hand again, Afifa? Okay.
Yes, thank you so much. And I also talk about the environment, writer and youth climate. Is there any platform like you people are working on, or Oxfam is also working on, like there had been a kind of many fellowships. There have been many certain ages like 25 to 35 years old, which can be a limit for such journalists. So this is a kind of, I think, a very hard stop to those journalists who cross just 35, like they are turned to 36, 37. So because they have spent a lot of time in journalism, and they have a vast experience about describing issues, so they can, I think, well narrate the issues about climate change. So I want to know, either there had been some kind of opportunities for such journalists who want to be a part of such youth initiatives and youth fellowships and all that. Um, is there any platform who can support journalists? And for a freelance journalist who are working in developing countries, they are very much um, they are also very marginalized, and also they need a kind of support to mention, though they have passion to describe things, but on the ground they are facing some challenges uh, like logistic issues and all that. So if and they, if they want to attend such kind of conferences and such kind of fellowships, they have to spend a lot of money to go to other countries and spend a lot of money in logistics and all that. So I want to ask, are there any platforms that make journalists able to attend apart from all their ages? Because I think a limitation of on age is a kind of thing that can stop productivity, and also the nature of the story. And also I want to ask, uh, there had been many collaborations that people mentioned before, that make stories happen in all the countries. So are there any kind of initiatives that can make journalists to write more stories, and then that can empower them related to those stories? Because I think such kind of platforms are very much positive, and they are very much helpful for journalists to mention those problems, because if they are not known to those problems, they can't do work on them. Because if I have been a part of such kind of fellowship, I would not be able to know about Paris Agreement and carbon and decarbonization and carbon market if I would not be able to known, if I was unaware of such issues. How would I be able to talk about climate justice and decarbonization and Paris? So I think such kind of fellowships are those opportunities that make a journalist being able.
Oh,
So yes,
yeah. Thank you so much, Aviva, for
thank
that.
you,
Is
thank
there
you.
anyone else who would want to answer that question? I'll also share something, but to our panel
Mhm.
first.
Okay, I'll answer that question, Kristine. Thanks, Afifa, for the question. I think the limitation she's mentioning, that was the recent fellowship for the youth communicators across Asia with Oxfam in Asia. So there's really an age limitation because the target audience are really the youth. But there are also several fellowship programs that Oxfam Philippines and I think other countries in Asia, other Oxfam countries in Asia are also doing now, to hold journalism fellowships regardless of age. So we also have that FIFA as well. And then I just want to mention as well, there's a platform yearly in Oxfam in Asia. It's called the Journalism for an Equitable Asia Awards, wherein we are encouraging journalists across Asia to submit stories about inequality, including the inequality caused by the climate crisis. So it's an opportunity for journalists to gather together. During the pandemic, we were not able to gather them only online, but now I think they're planning to do face to face again, gather and then recognize the efforts of these journalists and help them in amplifying these stories to the wider audience.
Thanks for that, April. Afifa, I commiserate with you because I'm turning 35 next year, and I understand because a lot of the long form stories that I did was really through fellowships, and that's the only way you would be able to cover it. Like I covered the UN Climate Action Summit with Climate Tracker, and I actually had to take a leave from work just so my newsroom managers would allow me to actually cover it. And I did. In the end, I still asserted that they should pay me my salary for the days that I covered, you know. But I can only imagine working as a journalist past the age of 35, because most of the opportunities really are for younger reporters. But this is a challenge as well, you know, to the funding organizations to open it up more for more veteran journalists who can do, you know, really significant stories. Climate Tracker offers fellowships, you know, just I'm sure you're familiar. They would publish opportunities from time to time. You should check out ijnet.org. They basically share all of the opportunities. Just go to their opportunities page and they list there all of the fellowships, scholarships, and a lot of them are not, you know, are not bound by the age of the journalist. So there are a lot of opportunities. Check out GIJN, Global Investigative Journalism Network as well, and maybe Pointer. So check out the international journalist organizations, and from time to time you will see it. Especially with climate, there's a lot of interest, or there's a lot of funding as well. So I hope you're able to find the right fellowship for you. There are many opportunities. I cannot remember the others, but if you do a search on those websites that I mentioned, especially ijnet.org, you should be able to find them. So I hope that helps. Unfortunately, that is the last question we will be accommodating. We're already losing some of our attendees. Thank you so much for sticking with us. There's some more questions, but I think our panelists are on Twitter. Maybe they can reach out to you guys. And you can send your questions to Climate Tracker as well. So perhaps you can send in our answers via email instead. So thank you so much for everyone for sticking around until past the end of our session. Next on the Climate Tracker conference is the Youth and Climate Storytelling on Twitter Spaces from 1 to 2 p.m. I think we will be flashing their QR code. I also wanted to thank April, Jing, Lynn, and Gila for very gamely answering all our questions today. And I salute all of you for the work that you do. It's very difficult to be in the climate reporting and space. So thank you for that. So we have Twitter Spaces at 1 p.m. telling stories through climate lens, youth in climate storytelling, and will be moderated by Gaia Cabico. And these are the list of our panelists. So you can just visit on your computer bit.ly/CTAsia TWT space D2. So I believe bit.ly is cap sensitive. So make sure to capitalize the right letters. And I think someone shared the link here as well in the chat. An easier way to go about it is just to maybe screen grab the QR code or to scan it so you can join later. So that's all for our session today. Thank you so much. And I hope you learned more tips and gained insight on how to give a more representative, more diverse climate stories. So thank you and good afternoon. Happy lunch, everyone.
We empower and connect environmental journalists, newsrooms, and NGOs around the world. Join our growing network, climatetracker.org.